Hi, welcome to another episode of our podcast, Conservation Conversations. I'm Moe Qureshi, the Director of Climate Research and Policy at the Conservation Council of New Brunswick, and today I'm joined by Randy Hatfield from the Human Development Council. Welcome to the podcast, Randy.
Thanks, nice to be with you.
Do you want to briefly introduce yourself and what you do at the HDC?
Sure, the Human Development Council is a social planning council. It was created in 1979. Our mission statement is to coordinate and promote social development, and that's when people's eyes first start to glaze. So when we unpack that, we sort of use a lot of data to fulfill that philosophical maxim of know thyself. What are we as a community? How are we relating to each other? How are we, do we have KPIs? Are we in fact getting to them? Where are the gaps? And once we find a gap, then I think it's our duty to try to incubate a response to that. So over the years, we've created the housing alternatives in St. John, the St. John Learning Exchange, the Community Loan Fund. We hosted the first local immigration partnership in St. John. Our principal focus now is not only researching social conditions. We're steering committee members of Campaign 2000, a national lobby group to eradicate child poverty. We participate nationally with the Institute of Research and Development on Inclusion in Society. So national networks are important for us. We can talk about New Brunswick and what it's like to navigate in it with our population as dispersed as it is. And we're focusing a lot now on homelessness. We're the community entity under the federal Reaching Home homelessness initiative for Moncton, Fredericton, and St. John. So we're promoting coordinated access, the use of HIFAS, the electronic tracking system, and doing a lot of monitoring and measuring of that challenge that's facing New Brunswick.
It's truly incredible work that you're doing, and really you're kind of on the front lines of this poverty discussion. Can you tell us a bit about the people you work with and kind of the poverty situation in New Brunswick?
Sure. I pinch myself every day, and I'm so relieved that I'm not a direct service provider. I think we owe so much gratitude to those that are on the front line working with vulnerable and marginalized populations. I think it's we're asking a lot for people to work with a traumatized population day after week after month. So I think vicarious trauma is something we have to be sensitive to, and the challenges in the working conditions, the nature of the sector in the province when it comes to levels of compensation, the precarity that accompanies contract work in the sector. So we have a host of challenges. Poverty has been a stubborn problem in New Brunswick and in certain parts of New Brunswick. We're based in St. John, although we now have offices in Fredericton and Moncton. And St. John has been known for decades as a place that has neighborhood concentrations in poverty that often lead the country. Part of the challenge about poverty is really defining it. You know, in our Economic and Social Inclusion Act in New Brunswick, it's there, and it's defined as opportunities and means and resources and power. Well, how can you measure that? So we can't and we don't. So we default to a crude proxy measure of income, create a poverty line, and there are dizzying ways of doing that. And once you establish the line, and you count those above and those below. So it's a very crude measure, and I think you have to embrace a social inclusion lens along with that economic vulnerability. But as an income measure, we have incredibly stubborn rates, as I said. And Campbellton has the highest child poverty rate in the province, for instance, well over 25%. It's the second highest would be in St. John, and Dieppe would have 11%. So the spatial distribution of populations in New Brunswick is galling and intriguing at the same time. I think of the St. John metropolitan area that has St. John as a central city within a catchment area of about 120 for the CMA, but St. John with 70,000 people is adjoined by two towns in the Kennebecasis Valley, Rossa and Quispamsis, that account for 30,000 people.
Right.
And when you look at the SES, or socioeconomic static measures, that exist and persist in those two communities, it's two worlds. It really is. And you can pick your poison, whether it's lone parent families, levels of education, income rates, levels of home ownership. We find dramatic disparities and differences within our metropolitan areas, more pronounced in St. John than Moncton and Riverview and Dieppe, or in Fredericton that now enjoys that CMA status, but doesn't have a lot of municipal entities surrounding the city of Fredericton. But nonetheless, there are varying amounts. And you would expect a central city to accommodate a lot of folks that need services and supports, but it's pretty stark right now in this province and in St. John in particular.
Gotcha. Thank you for that summary. This podcast is about the rate hearings.
Right.
And you're
Of
one
course.
of the interveners at the rate hearings. So do you mind explaining why did you want to intervene for these rate hearings?
We've been tracking child poverty for over a decade now as steering committee members of Campaign 2000. But we've never really taken a dive into energy poverty. And I credit the CEO of MB Power, Laurie Clark, who actually reached out and wanted to meet with us months ago. And so an early morning meeting was there, and she presented the challenges that MB Power faces, and it caused us, when she left, to sort of talk about this and think about access to the resource and funding of the resource and the whole concept of energy poverty. So then when the GRA was announced, or the general rate application, we applied to be interveners, and so we, along with the Coalition for People with Disabilities, were community nonprofits that participated this year in the hearing.
Gotcha. For our viewers who might not know, what does it mean to be an intervener at these hearings? And how did you find that overall process? Because I believe this was your first time.
It sure was, and it may be our last, I don't know. An intervener has a special status. A lot of people can contribute through public forums. You could actually make a submission and submit a written report and provide comments, but to be acknowledged as an intervener provides the status of participating in the hearings, being able to cross-examine witnesses, to participate in the fulsome discussions that take place, and there are lots of them. It was quite a deep dive into the file, with a few lessons that I think we'll be able to talk about as we move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And can anyone be an intervener at this?
There's a prescribed form and an application that one has to go through under the Energy and Utilities Board Act. But we applied when we indicated that our principal focus was on low-income residential consumers and customers. That's the cohort that we chose and the lens we chose for this particular hearing.
Gotcha. So this rate increase, it was for residential, it's about a 13.2% increase that's proposed.
Right.
Some of that's coming from the variance account.
Correct.
Do you want to break down what are your thoughts on this rate increase and this general rate application that NB Power put forward?
Well, at first blush, I don't think it's any surprise to think that 9.25% in each of the next 2 years, combined with the rate riders, that variance account mechanism, that in the first year would account for over 13%, in the second year 9%. So compounded, you're talking well over 20%, 22% in 2 years, and that's a huge number. And there are certain cohorts that would be dramatically affected by something like that. We think particularly of folks that are on social assistance. And if you look at the recent data on social assistance, you see that we have surpassed pre-pandemic levels. It's a perfect V in the number of cases and individuals relying on social assistance in New Brunswick.
Really?
When CERB first came in, for instance, during COVID, it put money in people's pockets, and you could see a bounce to people's steps. You saw food bank use decline. You saw people with more agency and participating. And almost on October the 15th, when it ceased, you can see the bottom sort of turn and a restoration of both the numbers. The cases now over 22,000, and the individuals involved over 37,000 now. So there's that cohort that is certainly under siege economically. Fixed income seniors is a cohort that I think deserves a lot of attention. I think of women in particular whose work was unpaid and didn't develop CPP credits, so they're relying on OAS and GIS.
Right. And
that is a very small amount. And then when you're faced with the recent increases in rent, in utilities, in food, an extra $25 to $50 a month makes the difference between going to a food bank or not, or balancing your budget or not. So there are certain cohorts in New Brunswick that we can you can safely assume will struggle to meet these new payments.
Yeah, if you don't mind, let's break that down a bit. So
Sure.
how do you envision that this rate increase might affect these low income families? And just to maybe build off of that, what can be done about it?
Well, I think there's a maximum heat or eat. And I
Right.
think many people are going to be faced with those sorts of situations. Energy poverty itself is a concept that is burden-based. You look at the amount of income that you would spend on electricity in the course of a year. And the general rule of thumb used by academics and researchers is that if you're spending more than 6% of your income on electricity or energy, then you're considered to be in energy poverty. And that produces in New Brunswick a very large number. Between 35 to 40% of New Brunswickers are in energy poverty. They spend more than 6% of their income on electricity. Now, of course, you'll always be high income earners that will spend and choose to heat an outdoor pool or use electricity well beyond the, for basic needs. So what we did when we tasked our research analysts and our data analysts to look at energy poverty is actually take a look at the cohort of low-income New Brunswickers based on the low-income after-tax measure and see how many of those were in energy poverty, and it was well over 80%.
Wow.
So of low-income New Brunswickers, more than 80% spend more than 6% of their budget on electricity. And so the answer, we believe, is a comprehensive energy poverty strategy. There are 4 pieces to that we can get into if you want.
Absolutely, yeah. Break down if the province were to make an energy poverty strategy.
Sure.
What would that look like?
Well, we're not the first jurisdiction to face this.
Right.
And many have dealt with it in a more thoughtful way and have actually put in place the 4 principal pillars that are involved in an energy poverty strategy. Right. The Low Income Energy Network in Ontario has prepared a pyramid that's meant to depict the 4 pieces of an energy poverty strategy. And one of them is efficiency measures, DSM, demand and supply programs. There are 4 residential programs in New Brunswick, for instance, that are available to residential consumers and customers. Only 1 to renters, which is another whole issue of users of electricity, whether you're a single-family detached home or whether you're actually in a rental unit. But efficiency measures that are meant to deal with the aging housing stock that we have, with the disrepair that is out there for many of much of our housing stock. Efficiency measures would decrease the amount of energy that a family or a consumer would require. So that's a good thing. So we looked at that energy piece, and we had certain observations and recommendations for the government on that pillar. The other is a whole idea of rules, customer rules, how you manage arrears, how disconnects are dealt with, how repayment schemes are put into place. And we recommended as well certain improvements on the system that currently exists in New Brunswick. Those are the 2 bottom pieces. The top one at the pyramid is emergency assistance. And we have in place the emergency fuel benefit, the electrical fuel supplement, as well as the rent bank, the latest intervention that's available in New Brunswick for energy consumers. So we have some emergency assistance pieces. What we're missing is an affordability piece. That's a gaping hole in the pyramid for New Brunswick.
And that's what's dominating the conversation these days, right? It's all about affordability.
Affordability
So what's that piece there?
Yeah. Well, we produced data on affordability that I think showed fairly conclusively that there's an affordability crisis in New Brunswick. According to the Canadian Income Survey in 2022, we had the lowest median income for economic families in the country. We had the highest poverty rate tied with Nova Scotia in the country. The CPI, when you sort of disaggregate and jump into the rabbit hole and get down to level 4 of 7, and you can take a look at components for inflation, we find that rent went up well over 10%, as did electricity, as did food. So those basic needs certainly impact a low-income family's budget more than it would the rest of us, for instance. But that affordability measure is dealt with primarily with a low-income rebate, with some means of acknowledging that if a low-income person spends more than 6% of their income on electricity, we should put in place some sort of rebate. Ontario does it. It's been discussed fulsomely in British Columbia. Manitoba's looked at it. Our neighboring province, Nova Scotia, has been tackling this particular issue since 2004.
Right.
20 years.
Right.
In 2004, an American expert was brought up, Roger Colton, who was also appeared in Ontario and in British Columbia, and in Nova Scotia in 2004 and in 2007, and he just authored in 2023 rather, an energy poverty strategy for Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
But that's the piece, and that's the argument that we made. We've got the 4 pieces of an energy poverty strategy that are generally recognized. We have in place 3 of them, and we can improve each of those. But what we're glaringly missing is that low-income rebate, that affordability measure that ensures that people have access to electricity, which is not a typical commodity. Mm-hmm. The other intervener, Shelley Petit, with the Coalition for People with Disability, ably represented that cohort and demonstrated the impact that cohort has. Mm-hmm. And the challenges, if you're on a ventilator, if you need dialysis, if you need a controlled environment where you live and home, then electricity is not a frill.
No,
it's life or death.
Right.
So that's there are disproportionate impacts on any public policy measure, but the disproportionate impact of increasing energy costs and stagnant or fixed incomes is profound in New Brunswick.
Gotcha. And to build on that, energy poverty has been kind of a recent term that's been brought up at the EUB, and you brought it up at the EUB while you intervened. Right. How was that discussion received during the hearings?
Oh, very well. I'm really pleased with the report that we authored, and with we actually had a panel of our data analyst and social researcher. We can talk about panels and how it worked. Like MB Bauer had 13. But this was the first time, I think, that they had a panel from the community nonprofits that was dealing exclusively with energy poverty. So it was it's sowing seeds. It's getting language into transcripts. If I've learned anything, stories are important. Stories are like data with a soul. I've heard them referred to, but you need evidence. At the end of the day, the EUB, that regulatory body, has to deal with evidence. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think it was important to get something before them that introduced the notion of energy poverty, how it was determined, how far-reaching it is in the province of New Brunswick, and then to advance certain proposals and ways that you can overcome it.
Yeah, I really thank you for bringing that topic to the EUB, because it's the first time that I've seen that they actually delve deep into that conversation. Mm-hmm. And speaking of which, can you break down, for this rate increase, and when it comes to talking about helping low-income families, what is NB Power's role in this? What is the government's role in this? And maybe even what is the non-profit sector's role in this?
Yeah. We bumped into early the jurisdictional issue in question. NB Power is a cost of service utility. That's how they define themselves, but it's really a cost of service monopoly. Okay? And the role of the EUB, arguably, is to provide that sort of competitive measure that an unregulated market, that a market will put into place. So it's up to the EUB to sand off the rough edges and to make choices that will hopefully address the concerns of low-income people. But their position is they lack the jurisdiction and authority to introduce something like a low-income measure. That's social policy. Their argument is that's the role and the obligation of government. Mm-hmm. Their obligation is to provide regular, efficient, clean, hopefully, and affordable energy.
Affordable. Is that word again?
But just and reasonable rates, the plain language of that reading has to be set aside, because through litigation it's been determined to have specific meanings and particular approaches to that phrase, just and reasonable. But NB Power's position was that they lack the jurisdiction to do it, sympathetic to the interests and concerns of low-income ratepayers. Their position is that their efficiency measures, their enhanced energy program, and the 3 others that can affect homeowners are ways of dealing with it. And look, that enhanced program is wildly popular. That's with the income threshold of below 70,000, you're entitled to a free heat pump. But it's certainly oversubscribed, and that's a challenge. And we raised with the board this idea of 70,000, which is defined as an LMI, low to moderate income.
Right.
And using one of the experts of the utilities board who pursued her notion that you should really, and other utilities do it, distinguish between low income and moderate income. If you're going to use data, if you're going to be data driven in your approach of ameliorating energy poverty, well, then I think it's important to understand the size of cohorts and the challenges that they're faced. And low income as opposed to moderate income is certainly a group that I think needs primary attention on the part of government.
Absolutely. So you covered kind of NB Power's role, the government's role. Is there a role that us nonprofits should be playing in all this?
Well, I think the advocacy role is very important.
Right,
if I was struck by anything, Mo, by doing our due diligence and our jurisdictional scan, is like how far behind we are in New Brunswick in terms of civil society and advocacy. And I think it stems from the fact, or part of that relates to the fact that we don't have a dominant urban area. We're the only province that doesn't. They tend to be provincial capitals outside of Quebec City or Victoria. But I look at HRM, Halifax Regional Municipality, with some envy. It's a provincial capital, a federal presence, regional head offices, a handful of universities, and 500,000 people. It's got the East Coast Environmental Law, it's got the Canadian Centre on Policy Alternatives, it's got think tanks. In New Brunswick, with 3 principal cities and none of them having more than 80,000 people, I can say with some certainty that the front line is engaged in what I would describe as containment measures. They're trying to keep the lid on things. Right. The opportunities to go deep on systems and to effect lasting change is a real struggle.
Thank you very much for your insight. Before we wrap things up, I think there was a quote that you maybe wanted to share.
Well, there's lots I could share with you, but I've been struck by Kelly Lamrock's report on how it all broke. And the penchant in New Brunswick to be concerned more about rules than outcomes, and how that really tends to tilt and to shift things and make it very difficult to come about changes. But he writes in his report that I would commend to any of your listeners and viewers, when rules clash with results, rules win in the New Brunswick government. And I think we see that in... when we talked about arrears, for instance, and payment plans and the rules that are circumscribed, really that lack of jurisdiction or that ability to exercise discretion, I think that fixation with rules really holds back our intervention for cases that do deserve consideration.
Gotcha. Thank you so much, Randy. Thank you for coming on the show.
You're welcome.
And just wanted to tell our listeners that you can visit the conservationcouncil.ca, our website. If you want to learn more information, please subscribe to our podcast newsletter and become a member. And please visit the Human Development Council's website. We'll include all of this at the bottom for if you want to learn more. And if you want to see another episode with both of us talking about the EB rate hearings or just general discussion, let us know. Thank you.